Great. So I'm a research fellow at the University of Reading, and this is about the fellowship I did with the Future of UK Treescapes that was funded by DEFRA, and it is about facilitating the expansion of agroforestry systems in the UK, such as this agroforestry system, which you can see here. It's a silvo arable system. So agroforestry is a land management approach that integrates trees or shrubs with agricultural systems. This includes productive and non-productive trees, so things like timber, fruit, nut, and also trees for biodiversity, which is what you saw in the last system. That was a mixed broadleaf system. It includes regular planting arrangements such as alley cropping, like what you can see here, or irregular planting arrangements, so that might include shelter belts. It also includes hedgerows and riparian strips, and there's lots of jargon around agroforestry. So you may have heard other words related to it, like silvo-arable, which is arable and trees, silvopasture, which is pasture and trees, silvopoultry, which is chickens and trees, and then alley cropping, which is strips of trees or shelter belts, which are used to protect livestock. So these are all different types of agroforestry systems. Agroforestry has been shown to have demonstrated benefits to biodiversity, ecosystem functions, production and profits, and climate resilience under certain management scenarios. So I've got some example results showing that here. So these are studies that have come out of the University of Reading. The top two figures are taken from a paper by Alexa Vara, which show that silvo-arable systems have higher bee abundance compared to arable systems and greater hoverfly abundance, which is important, both of which are important for pollination. The results down below are from Rosie Scholes, who showed that there's greater earthworm abundance in the tree row and that this spills out into the crop alleys and silvo-arable system. And Rosie's also finding promising results for earthworm species richness and soil organic matter, but these are pending. In addition to this, there's widespread appetite for adoption, which means there's the potential for large-scale impact. So the government has a statutory commitment to increase agroforestry to 10% of agricultural land by 2050. And this is going to be, I'm just going to minimize this little window here so that I can see the slide. Okay. And this is going to be done through a variety of payment schemes. What that means in practice, to give you some numbers, is that in the UK, 70% of land is agricultural. 3% of that approximately is currently in agroforestry. If this increases to 10%, that would be an increase in planting area of about 11,000 kilometers squared, which in units of Wales, because everybody always loves when you give things in units of Wales, is 60% the size of Wales, about 60%. Despite all these potential benefits and the appetite for adoption, there are still major barriers to uptake. So this has been shown through a few different studies, including the ELMS test and trial studies, which were done in 2021, which were a result of farmer surveys and workshops. And this showed that farmer knowledge is a major barrier to uptake. So finance was a barrier to uptake, and farmer knowledge was the second major barrier. In addition to this, there are lots of large knowledge gaps around agroforestry. So this was a systematic review on biodiversity in silvo-arable versus arable systems in temperate systems, and each number shows a different publication. But what I want you to think about here is really the many ways that you can vary just this type of agroforestry, which is silvo-arable agroforestry. So you can change the arable intercrop, you can vary the understory width, you can vary the crop alley width, how the trees are managed, the distance between the trees. So this is actually, there's lots of options for how we can manage these systems, and the research supporting different management options is quite limited at the moment. So there are lots of knowledge gaps about how to do this best. Addressing these things will help us to get and keep land managers motivated. If they're growing in the most effective way, they're going to have the best results. It will help us to maximize environmental benefits and reduce risks. So agroforestry can provide a whole host of benefits. There's strong evidence for that. But planting at this scale, it's really important that we we do it in the most evidence-based way as possible. I've done a very rough back of the envelope calculation about the use of how much money will be spent to meet these tree targets. So depending on the options which farmers choose, these payment options have just been released in SFI as part of ELMS last month. And depending on the farming options farmers choose, adopting agroforestry may cost anywhere between 2 to 45 million and will cost 3 to 10 million per year to maintain. So this is quite a lot of public money, and it's important that it's used effectively. The other thing that we need to consider about agroforestry is that these tree planting targets are really ambitious and should be applauded. And if we can show a way to do this effectively, it will help to promote agroforestry internationally, because we're a really strong case study then for how to effectively increase tree planting. So this is a really exciting time to be working in agroforestry. And I am looking at, for the fellowship, I looked at agroforestry knowledge specifically. And the first part was around farmer knowledge gaps. So what are the specific knowledge gaps farmers perceive? And what are the barriers and opportunities for overcoming these gaps? So to do this, I conducted interviews with 27 farmers across southern England from last year into early this year. And I spoke to a range of farmers across different genders, different age groups, different farming types and systems. So arable, pastoral, horticultural, mixed, different farming systems in terms of conventional, integrated, organic, and also across different farm sizes. So 27 farmers can't be considered to represent all of farmers' opinions, of course, but we have a sample size that represents a range of different practices and demographics. And what I did in these interviews was I used something called a perception matrix to assess their knowledge about different topics and their perceived knowledge, the perceived barriers to obtaining knowledge about these different topics. So on the top, you can see different aspects of knowledge that are needed to adopt agroforestry or manage it. So things like agroforestry funding, tree species and variety selection, through to things like more management, things like markets for agroforestry impacts, long-term financial impacts, and legal and regulatory impacts. And then I had statements about what they thought about these different aspects of knowledge. So here we have knowledge about this is important for successfully adopting or managing in-field agroforestry on my farm. And if they agreed with that, they would score a 1. And if they didn't agree with that, this is the opposite statement. So knowledge about this is not important, then they would score a 5. So they went through this and put scores in based on how they think this agroforestry knowledge relates to these statements. So this farmer is saying knowledge about agroforestry funding is really important, but knowledge about tree species and variety selection isn't really important to them. And there was a whole list of statements about each type of knowledge. So whether knowledge about this was important, whether they know about it, whether they think advice or information is available, whether they think finding advice or information they can trust would be easy, whether time is a constraint in accessing information, whether affording information is a constraint. So farmers may get information about these different things from different sources. So for example, tree species, variety and selection, they may use online resources for free, but potentially for long-term financial impacts, they may look for one-to-one advice. So in that case, finance may be a barrier for financial impacts, but not for tree species variety. And then the final 2 questions are about whether they think understanding advice or information on this would be easy, or whether the thought of learning about it does not feel daunting or feels daunting. And so these statements, the different types of knowledge, and the statements around barriers to adopting farming practices came from meetings with stakeholders and also reviewing the literature around adopting new farming practices. So the farmers put numbers in each of these boxes going along the rows with some discussion. And then you can turn it into these beautiful plots. Everybody loves a good plot. And I'm not going to talk you through all of this. Obviously, this is a little bit overwhelming the way it's presented now, but I'm just going to highlight some of the key findings. So first, what you can see is that in the top row, there are a lot of scores where people have agreed with this statement. So they've said knowledge about these things is important. And also we have a lot of disagree down here. So knowledge about a lot of these things is important, and they don't know about it. So this is already showing what we suspected, that there are barriers, knowledge barriers to agroforestry uptake. But more specifically, if you look at these individually, you can see differences in what those barriers are. So for agroforestry funding, this says knowledge about it is really important. Farmers don't know about it at all. And that's because they think advice isn't available. Potentially that they don't trust it, and finding time to access it is an issue. But if it's not available, this is a major barrier. Now, this has probably changed slightly since the time that this study was done, but we took these results forward into a workshop to design solutions. So I'm continuing to show you this today, even though now there are agroforestry funding schemes which may have affected this variable specifically. So if you look at then the other side of this, you can see a very different barrier to knowledge. So here we have long-term financial impacts and legal and regulatory impacts. And you can see again that these are ranked as really important, but that farmers don't know about them. But what you can see is that the scores which are coming out the highest are around trusting information, finding time to access it. But most importantly, what we're seeing down here is that there is concerns about being able to understand this and finding the process of learning about it daunting. So the type of intervention that you need to promote knowledge about these things within the farming community will be different to what you need for agroforestry funding. So for agroforestry funding, where you can potentially just release the information and explain it through videos and clips and online articles, for long-term financial impacts and legal and regulatory impacts, you may need a more tailored approach with one-to-one advice, because farmers are finding this daunting, which means that it's a larger barrier to uptake. Then I'm also going to look at tree species variety and tree planting arrangement. So this is a similar pattern to agroforestry funding. So you can see they agree that it's important, but they don't know about it. There's some people saying advice is not available, but it's also coming down to trusting the advice and finding time to access it. But really, the main thing here is that people think the advice is more or less available, and that understanding it would be easy. They don't feel daunted about learning about it. So it's kind of just putting this into a format where people can access it and digest it easily. Whereas this needs a more considered approach. For the people who are very mathematically inclined, I also looked at the variation, which showed how agreement levels differed. And this does show variation, but actually these scores overall show that there was high agreement. So this means that the farmers rank things in a similar way, which is good in terms of interpreting the results. So I took these results to a 2-day workshop at Farm Ed, where I did a 2-day workshop. And the first day was a training day where farmers got a bespoke agroforestry plan with farm advisors, agroforestry advisors, and this included 20 farmers. Then on the second day, we had 51 stakeholders across 39 organizations, in breakout groups. We looked at 5 key statements that I wrote based on these results, and then we brainstormed solutions to those statements. So the first statement was lack of knowledge about agroforestry funding is a major barrier to agroforestry adoption. Farmers do not think advice or information is available. And I think some of these solutions would still be useful to implement, even though the SFI schemes have been released. So for example, farmers suggested to create a searchable database for funding schemes that would include government schemes, but also other schemes. And maybe if this could include a postcode search. Then tailored one-to-one advice on stacking offers. So often there are multiple funding options available, and it's about working out how to combine those funding options is a barrier. Then this I thought was a really good suggestion. In particular, some people were saying that if you haven't done agroforestry before and you're looking for a funder to do it, then it can be difficult to know what the strengths or weaknesses of different funding options are. So maybe farmers who've adopted agroforestry could create kind of like an FAQ list for farmers to use to sense check, okay, have I checked everything that's really important with these schemes that I should think about? So maybe they'd want to think about maintenance or replacing trees? Is the scheme going to offer replacing trees if some of them die? Those kinds of things that they may not think of if they haven't done agroforestry before. The second statement was knowledge about the legal, regulatory, and long-term financial impacts are also major knowledge barriers. And farmers think they may not be able to understand advice or information on this and find the prospect of learning about it daunting. So what was suggested for this was using long-term experimental demonstration farms with funding support, because nothing can make a stronger case for the long-term financial impacts than real-world examples. Then there was discussion around having funded independent advisors that know about forestry and farming, and potentially the need for an agroforestry accreditation, because interest in agroforestry is increasing so rapidly. There are lots of agroforestry advisors, and farmers would like to know what sort of their qualifications are. So this was suggested, having an agroforestry accreditation. And then also having funded farmer to farmer mentoring, because there is a lot of mentoring going on between agroforestry farmers, particularly farmers who've been doing this for a long time. And currently they're doing that on goodwill. But is there a way to implement that in a more structured and supported way so that potentially it could be scaled up? The final example of a statement I'm going to give is that knowledge about tree species variety or species selection and planting arrangement is also a barrier, but farmers think that they would be able to learn about this easily and could find trusted advice. So for this, demonstration farms came up again, because seeing real world examples is a really valuable way of learning. There was the suggestion to include agroforestry in college education, because currently it's divided by forestry and agriculture. And this could be a way of getting people thinking about agroforestry early. Then a lot of people were talking about the benefit of agroforestry workshops, conferences, and training days. So in-person learning for these particular aspects of knowledge. So in total, I've just gone through a few suggestions from 3 statements, but in total we had 5 statements and 32 specific suggestions. And summarizing these into key findings, I would say that farmers think they know little about agroforestry management, with some knowledge gaps perceived as more important than others. The perceived barriers attaining to this knowledge depend on the type of knowledge, and agroforestry advice or education should be tailored by knowledge type to account of this for it to be most effective. Trying to synthesize it into one approach, which is boiling it down quite a lot, I would say the most effective approach would likely include tailored and funded one-to-one advice on the business side of things. So that's the long-term financial, legal, and regulatory impacts, and workshops and online resources for the ecological side. So things like planting, species selection, and pruning. And I think one thing that came out strongly for all of the barriers was the value of long-term demonstration sites and farmer-to-farmer networks. So that's really key for adopting agroforestry. And the plan is to boil these down into a national education plan for UK agroforestry. Okay, so that was an introduction to the educational priorities, looking at the knowledge gaps for farmers. The second part of this project looked at research knowledge gaps and priorities to create a list of research priorities. And so this involved gathering research questions. So this was done by an online survey, which included 68 people. And I also collected questions from a workshop, which was led by partners listed there, that 40 people attended at the Agroforestry show. These people were across a range of stakeholders. So you can see these aren't just questions that were submitted by one stakeholder group. So you've got everybody across the agroforestry sector included here. So researchers, policymakers, farmers, farm advisors, NGOs. And I took these questions and boiled them down into a subset of questions, 151 questions, which were then taken to a 2-day workshop. This workshop, this is the same workshop as I described previously. So we had 51 participants from 39 organizations and 20 farmers. And we put these questions through a prioritization process using something called a Delphi-like process, which, if you're not familiar with it, it essentially means that you do private individual voting, and then you have group discussion, and then you have re-voting. And we did 2 rounds of this. So we had private voting, group discussion, group voting, and then we had private voting, group discussion, group voting. This could have resulted, depending on the level of agreement between the groups about what questions to include, this could have resulted in anywhere from 26 to 78 questions. And we've ended up with a top 40, which is satisfying for several reasons, but mostly because it shows that we had a high level of agreement. So because this is in the lower end of the number of questions we could have ended up with, it shows that people agreed that these were the top priority questions. So that's really positive. So these questions spanned human livelihoods, knowledge and perceptions, environment and production. We had 29 questions, policy, financing and markets, and some of them were across all of the themes. In terms of human livelihoods, there was questions around the nutrient value of animal products that had come from agroforestry systems, and questions around human well-being, including farmer workload and mental load. I'm not going to present all 29 questions around environment and production. That would be quite long. So I'm just going to summarize them into some key themes. So there was questions around crop, tree and understory selection, establishment methods, nutrients, biodiversity, soil and ecosystem functions, yield and quality, climate resilience and carbon stocks, and habitat connectivity and landscape scale changes. So I think this is like a broad range, covering a broad range of different types of environmental and production topics. So here are just some example questions there. And most of these I've referred to when I've drawn out the themes. The one that I would like to draw your attention to in particular is down the bottom, which is how can farmers self-assess the benefits of agroforestry? I think a real asset of UK farming is that we have so many farmers who are so engaged and interested in learning about what's happening on their farms. I really feel that when I'm working with farmers, that there's a high level of engagement. And I think it's really interesting to see that this question made it into the top research priorities. And I think it's really important that farmers can self-assess and see impacts on their own farms when they're implementing changes. So I was excited about that. Then there are questions around policy incentives, income, of course, these are businesses, and around the current and future markets. This thing about current and future markets has come up quite a lot in the educational priorities and in the research priorities. And I think it's something which farmers are finding challenging, is working out what to plant potentially when they've been thinking on shorter timescales, in arable or pastoral systems, and now they're looking at products which may be harvested, 30 or 40 years down the line. So that does require change in thinking. Again, long-term research sites, they keep coming up, and the implication of for UK food production, it's really important that we think about that. Questions around net zero and whether agroforestry can contribute to renewable energy production and circular systems on farm by biomass creating energy. And then this is a really interesting question as well. How will large scale conversion to agroforestry in the UK impact society and land use change elsewhere? So the stakeholder group that we had was really very UK focused. They were UK organizations or UK farmers and UK based researchers. So I think it's really interesting that this question, looking beyond the UK, made it into the top 40 because there was a selection process. And I think it shows the agroforestry community and agroforestry stakeholders are really interested in the impacts of agroforestry at scale and globally. And this is I think it's a really positive way to be thinking because that is important. So the next steps for this are that I will convert this into a scheme. I'm in the process of converting this into a scheme with an artist and then publishing this. The aim is to create a handbook with evidence summary for each research question, and there's a few avenues I'm pursuing to try to get this done at the moment, but hopefully that would be a really great outcome. and also to promote this so that future research grants can use these questions to choose research topics. So the key findings here are that agroforestry stakeholders in the UK have a broad understanding of the potential impacts of agroforestry across scales and subjects. We identified many knowledge gaps that urgently need to be addressed to maximise the benefits of agroforestry planting and reduce the risks, but there was also high agreement about the questions to exclude. So the questions that we included did cover a broad range of topics, but there were also a lot of questions that we excluded. So I think it shows that these really are high priority. To address these questions, we really need long-term transdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder research projects, just to get all the buzzwords in. And that's because agroforestry is a long-term intervention. And so short-term experiments are not going to be able to see how the system changes through time. And again, funded demonstration sites are really key. So they're key for improving research gaps and also educational gaps. Then thinking more broadly beyond the questions that we came out with at the end, I also think one of the results is that the multi-stakeholder workshop was a really effective way of co-producing the shared research priorities. We had high agreement, but beyond that, there are also many participants who are now collaborating to address these gaps. And I think the process of doing this has resulted in more outcomes than just the questions. It's built collaborations and things. So I think that's a real success of using a participatory method like this. The next steps for me, so I'm going to build on the work that's been done in this fellowship to create long-term demonstration sites with the aim of conducting research, but also promoting knowledge around agroforestry. And the aim is to produce experiments which will be co-designed with stakeholders and farmers in particular to identify best management for the environment, production and climate resilience. And I have a few collaborators for this already, but if this is something that interests you or that you would like to collaborate on, please do reach out because I'm going to start building this soon and it would be great to have as many partners as possible. A hypothetical outcome of this, just to show you what it might look like, is that you could have something called a mother and baby trial, where you have different things that you're varying. So you could do a biodiversity gradient of trees, test different tree species or planting arrangements, and then farmers could choose a subset of these treatments so that you have replicated experiments across the country. And I have some existing experiments within this network already. So there's a nitrogen fixing tree experiment up in Bromborough Estate that Andrew Mahan designed with Ed Colbert, who's on this call, I believe. This is a farmer-funded trial with nitrogen fixing trees mixed in with walnut and non-nitrogen fixing trees. And then I have a PhD student starting this year, Leila Nicholson, who's going to be co-designing understory crop experiments with farmers, and that's in collaboration with DEFRA. So that will be testing different understory crops to see if we can promote biodiversity, production, and ecosystem functions. So the aim is to do all of those things at once. Yeah, so please reach out if you want to collaborate on these projects. And I want to say thank you to DEFRA and the Future of UK Treescapes for funding. Thanks to everyone who helped me at the workshop, and particularly the people listed there. To everyone at DEFRA for the really warm welcome when I did my secondment with them, to the Woodland Trust for support, and to our leaders of the Future of UK Treescapes, and to FarmEd and all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Millie. That was really, really thorough and really, really interesting. If anyone would like to put cameras back on so that it doesn't look like Millie and I talking to each other, that'd be great. And unless I'm seeing things wrongly, there aren't any questions in the chat unless I've got the page wrong. So does anybody have questions at the moment to ask? I actually have one, Millie, and it's coming from a position of relative ignorance, I think. So apologies for that. But you know, you're discussing a lot of all the farmers you're sort of involved with on this co-production seemed very engaged, very sort of motivated. What would you say is the level of sort of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation for farmers to be involved in agroforestry? You know, to where does it, what really is driving them to be interested?
Hmm. Yeah, that I have an opinion about that, but um, I don't have the evidence to back it up scientifically. So I'm going to give you my opinion. Um, yeah, I mean, my feeling is when I've been working with farmers that they all care deeply about what they do. And, you know, I think we have a strong sense of identity around being a farmer in the UK. And um, there's a strong sense of responsibility for the land and passing the land on. And even the farmers that I work with who say, you know, this is a business, it's all about production. I'm not going to do it if it's not going to work for the farm. Um, and it is a business, so that makes sense. But even farmers who present themselves as being more conventional farmers or speak in this way, I think when you speak to them for a longer period of time or you're more open, they do feel a big sense of responsibility and they want to do the best thing. They just want to be able to do it and supported to do it. Yeah, I think we're very lucky that in my experience, the custodians that we have are really engaged. Because I mean they're experiencing the changes that we're having firsthand, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Some questions have appeared in the chat. One is a question about the mother and baby scheme. And can agroforestry systems be, sorry, I've got another thing, be retrofitted into that network?
Yes, that is a good question. I think it depends on, well, the thing about retrofitting, I mean, I think if I was working in silvopastoral systems, that might be easy, but silvoarable systems, there aren't a huge number of them. Certainly, we will include existing systems. Yeah, I think it's definitely possible, and the plan is to include mature systems in the network. Um, but the aim is to plant experimental systems as well. Does that answer your question?
I imagine so. Thank you. There's also some words of praise on how good your presentation was. And then another question is what funding might be available for the demonstration sites that you're working on? Is that available now, or is that something you're going to have to apply for as you develop the sites?
Well, I've got some funding to develop the sites as part of the fellowship, which I'm going to be starting in November. But I think that, you know, this is like my that's going to be it's a single project. I think what we really need is a system of funding where farmers are rewarded or encouraged to participate in science and collaborate with scientists to create long-term experiments, because I really feel that that will benefit science because farmers are so creative and they know their systems better than anyone else, but it will also benefit farmer to farmer knowledge exchange because examples are the best way to see and learn things. So I would love to see funding for scientific demonstration sites to be part of some kind of funding schemes. Yeah, I think that would be really powerful. But yeah.
Right. Thank you. And another one relating to publications. So when and where will the results of this work be published?
Hopefully really soon. So yeah, I've finished the fellowship and I'm working on the postdoc I was working on whilst I was doing the fellowship at the same time. And I'm clearing a couple of things off my plate and then it's top priority. But the hopefully the scheme, which will be able to be shared, should be ready sooner. And I'm very happy to share the research priorities with anyone directly that is interested. So you can have the results by email, but yeah, not published yet.
Yeah, and you'll have access to this recording, and I noticed the email and contact details are on the final slide. So anyone who wants to look at that. Thanks, Millie. Great talk. Really appreciate it. There we go. That's not a question though. Okay. Are there any plans for the peer-to-peer knowledge exchange platform? Because it sounds like a great idea and it could link with initiatives that are, sorry, my screen's really not being friendly. If anyone can read the last bit of that, that'd be great because it's just
That are
vanished.
already underway, e.g. KTIF and agroecology in Scotland.
Great, thank you.
That's all right. Yes, so there are a few knowledge exchange. Yeah, so I think there are a few knowledge exchange platforms where farmers are doing peer-to-peer learning. So LEAF at the moment, Linking Environment and Farming, have an agroforestry program. The Forestry Commission are doing a lot on agroforestry advice at the moment. They've just recruited 10 new agroforestry advisors. Um, there are a few grants in review from Reading looking at ways of getting more farmer networks. And we also have a agroforestry farmer network that we are hoping to kind of expand and communicate with more. And then the fellowship, when I start that and set up the demonstration sites, there will be peer-to-peer learning will be a central part of that in terms of developing the experiments and planting the trees. So that will be the first phase of that project. But yeah, it would be really good to link initiatives because I think because of the schemes coming out recently and just the growing interest in agroforestry, there are a lot of educational resources on agroforestry now and options for people to learn about it, but they are a bit disconnected and disparate at the moment. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, a motorbike went past, sorry. That brings us to the end of questions so far in the chat, but I wonder if anybody else has a question, please, can you speak rather than raise your hand? Oh, hang on, there's one more appeared in the chat. Yeah. It's from Ed Colbert letting us know that the second agroforestry show will take place in September 2025. So those of us wanting to know more about that, that's where to head.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ed. If anyone has questions, again, please pop them in the chat or speak out and we'll know you're speaking. Other than that, I think all that remains for me to do is to thank Millie for that really, really professional, really informative and exciting view of what the future of agroforestry can be with people like Millie working towards it. So thanks very much, everybody. And as we've said, oh, is that just a wave from Martin or a hand up? Just a wave, I think, as a clap. So
thanks.
Millie, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending. As we said, this will soon be available. The recording will be available so you can review it, and feel free to contact Millie with further questions, ideas and thoughts and indeed praise. Thank you very much. Millie, that was great. Thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy the afternoon.
Thanks for joining.